The evening air was cool, with a soft breeze swirling down the city streets, causing leaves to dance in the gutters. A young man, dressed in a smart jacket that contrasted against the graying buildings, walked briskly along the sidewalk, deep in thought. He had just finished his shift at a local cafe, his mind buzzing from the constant rush of orders, friendly banter, and the familiar hum of the city. His body longed for the comfort of home, where he could shed the day's exhaustion and relax. As he passed a bus stop, a loud, bitter voice broke through the calm of the evening. "Go back to Africa," the voice screamed, harsh and full of venom. The words sliced through the air like a sharp blade, cutting into him in an instant. He stopped, mid-step, and turned his head slowly, looking for the source of the attack. Standing near the bus stop was a woman, middle-aged, with a tense, bitter expression on her face. Her eyes were cold, her lips curled into a sneer as if she had just said something she truly believed. The young man's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he just stared at her, unable to process the words that had just been thrown at him. It wasn't that he hadn't faced prejudice before, it was just the sheer directness of it that caught him off guard. The audacity. The venom. Her words weren't just hateful, they were an attempt to erase him, to belittle him, to make him feel less than human. The street around them seemed to slow down, like time itself had drawn a pause. People nearby glanced over, some of them looking away, others awkwardly shifting their gaze. No one stepped forward. It was as if the confrontation didn't concern them. The young man stood still, absorbing the tension in the air. He wasn't angry, not at first. Instead, a profound sense of disbelief washed over him. This kind of hatred still existed in the world. It was real, raw, and unabashed. But then, the disbelief began to fade, replaced by something else, calm. His heart settled. He wasn't going to let this moment control him. It was as though the silence of the evening had given him clarity, a quiet assurance that he didn't need to react in anger. This woman, whoever she was, didn't get to dictate his response. Not today. He took a deep breath and looked her directly in the eye, his gaze unwavering. There was no fear, no hesitation. Just certainty. "Do you know what you're saying?" he asked softly, his voice steady, though his words carried weight. The woman blinked, as though surprised by his composed response. She opened her mouth to speak again, but he continued before she could. "You don't know me, but I know one thing. You don't have the power to send anyone anywhere. This city, this country, it's a place for all of us. It's built by people of all backgrounds, from every corner of the world, and your words don't change that." His words hung in the air, unexpected, like a gentle yet firm rebuke. The woman flinched, perhaps not expecting the calmness in his voice, nor the sharpness of his counter. For a moment, she seemed at a loss, her grip on the anger fading as she realized that the young man was not reacting the way she'd hoped. She wanted him to fight back, to show that his skin color could be used as a weapon to divide. But that was not his way. "I am where I belong," he continued, his eyes still locked with hers. "You should learn that before you speak. Hate doesn't belong here. And you? You have to do better than that." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time, she seemed to be searching for something, an excuse, a defense, maybe an apology. But nothing came. The crowd around them had begun to notice, and a few people nearby exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement with the young man's words. He felt no triumph. He wasn't seeking to win the moment. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about standing firm, about not letting someone else's hate define him or how he saw the world. He knew that this wasn't just about him either. It was about everyone who had been subjected to similar hatred, whether in words or actions. It was about the quiet strength of a community that refused to allow hate to gain a foothold. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving the woman behind, silent and speechless. The evening felt different now. The city no longer seemed as cold or indifferent as it had moments before. There was power in choosing peace, in choosing to rise above the hate and not let it seep into his own heart. The young man knew that in the grand scheme of things, this one moment wouldn't change the world. But it had changed something in him. As he continued walking, a few heads turned, and someone from the crowd muttered under their breath, "That was incredible." He smiled slightly, but he wasn't thinking about praise. What mattered was that he had chosen dignity, that he had met hate with calm strength. And in that simple act, he had reminded himself, and perhaps others, that words only have power if we allow them to. The young man continued walking, his mind a flurry of thoughts, yet somehow, his body felt lighter. The streets, once familiar and bustling with the usual noise of city life, now seemed almost different. He wasn't sure why, but something in the air felt charged, like his simple act of standing up had shifted something around him. He couldn't help but replay the scene in his mind. The woman's hateful words, his steady response, the stunned silence that followed. He wondered if she had hurt him. Really hurt him. Maybe she'd walk away from that moment, stewing in her own bitterness, or maybe, just maybe, his words had penetrated through the walls she'd built around herself. He could never know for sure, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was how he felt, peaceful, resolute, and more connected to his own sense of purpose. As he turned the corner, he pulled out his phone, distracted momentarily by a new text from his best friend, who was curious about his evening plans. He typed back, telling him he was heading home to rest, but that one thing had stood out that day, an encounter with a woman at the bus stop. His friend responded quickly, eager for the details. "Man, what happened? Are you okay?" the message read. His friend's concern was genuine, but the young man didn't feel like what happened needed an explanation. He didn't feel threatened, nor did he feel like he had been attacked. It wasn't about self-defense. It was just a moment where he had chosen to rise above, and that was all. Still, he typed out a brief recount of the incident, emphasizing how he'd reacted not out of anger but out of the simple realization that hate could only thrive if we allowed it to. He described his response, not to boast, but to process it. The text read, "She told me to go back to Africa, but I told her that the city we live in is for everyone. People from all walks of life, with all kinds of stories. And she's no exception. She doesn't have the power to tell me or anyone else where to go. I've got a place here, just like everyone else." His friend's reply came swiftly. "Bro, that's wild. Honestly, a lot of people would have snapped back. But you didn't. You stayed calm. You really shut her down without raising your voice." The text was followed by a thumbs-up emoji, but it was clear that his friend, too, was a little stunned by his composure. For the first time in his life, the young man felt as if his actions might have made an impact beyond just himself. The weight of the situation, though painful, had prompted him to see something that had previously felt unimportant, the power of his voice. The way he chose to speak in that moment wasn't just for his own dignity, it was for everyone who had ever suffered under the weight of someone's hatred. A week passed. The city seemed to move on, but for him, it felt as though the experience had left an impression. In every interaction he had with people during that week, from his work at the cafe to casual encounters on the street, he began to feel a deep sense of empathy for the struggles others faced. He'd always known about prejudice, of course, but the attack that day had opened his eyes to just how pervasive it was, and how necessary it was to speak out against it. One afternoon, while volunteering at a local community center, the young man met a girl, no older than 12, who had been a target of bullying at school. The girl had long, dark braids that framed her face and a somber expression. Her story, too, was one of hateful words, racial slurs, and the kind of hurt that was hard to shake off. The young man could see in her eyes the same quiet struggle he had often carried with him, the burden of feeling like an outsider, the fear that somehow, you didn't belong. As he listened to her, he thought back to the woman at the bus stop. How similar the girl's experience was, how the cruelty she faced mirrored his own. He knew then that his response to the woman had been about more than just defending himself. It had been a lesson in standing up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The realization struck him hard. Every time he allowed hate to slide by without speaking up, he was enabling it to persist. The girl smiled at him as he spoke, her eyes brightening with each word of encouragement. He told her, "What people say doesn't define you. You define you. Don't let anyone's ignorance tell you who you are. You're strong, and you belong here, just like everyone else." In that moment, he knew his decision to speak up at the bus stop had reached beyond his own confrontation. It had touched her, in some small way, by helping her believe that standing up for herself was not only possible, it was necessary. This wasn't just his story. It was a story of strength, resilience, and hope for others who had been told that they didn't matter. As he left the community center that day, he couldn't help but feel a sense of calm, like the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed were slowly starting to come together. The young man had always wondered what difference one person could make in the face of widespread hatred, but now he understood. It wasn't just about fighting back, it was about showing others that their dignity was worth standing up for. And in doing so, he had found his voice, and maybe, just maybe, his purpose. The days after that encounter seemed to pass in a blur. The young man found himself thinking back to the moment at the bus stop more often than he expected. It wasn't that he wanted to dwell on the incident, it was the shift it had caused in him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something had changed. The feeling lingered, quiet but persistent, like a seed planted deep within his soul, waiting to grow. As he walked through the bustling streets of the city, his eyes were more observant, his mind sharper. He saw the little things now, the sideways glances, the subtle microaggressions, the small slights that were often brushed off or ignored. He'd always been aware of racism, of course, but it was different now. It wasn't just something that happened to other people. It was something that was happening around him every day, in ways that were harder to see, but just as damaging. He walked into the cafe where he worked one afternoon and noticed a regular customer, a middle-aged man who came in daily for his coffee, glaring at a new employee, a young woman with a thick accent. The man's face twisted in disgust, his lips curling with disdain as she took his order. The young man could see it in the customer's eyes, even if he didn't say anything out loud. The subtle way he looked down at her, the barely audible sighs as she struggled with the register. It was the kind of behavior that most people wouldn't notice, but he could feel it, and it bothered him more than he expected. Later that afternoon, when the cafe was quieter, he took the young woman aside. Her name was Maria, and she was fresh off the plane, new to the city, and trying to make her way. The young man knew her well enough by now to see the nerves that clung to her every word and movement. He also saw the bruises on her spirit, the small slights she'd endured in the short time she'd worked there. "I saw how that man was looking at you," he said, his voice soft but direct. "And I just want you to know, it's not about you. People like him, they can't see past their own ignorance. But you're doing just fine." Maria smiled a little, though her eyes betrayed the doubt she still carried. "I know I'm not perfect," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I try my best, and sometimes, I just don't know if it's enough." The young man shook his head gently. "You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be yourself. And that's enough." He paused for a moment, trying to find the right words. People like him, people who think their way is the only way, they'll always find something to criticize. But that doesn't mean you need to take it to heart. You're stronger than that. Maria nodded, but the concern didn't leave her face. "I just don't want them to think I don't belong here." "You do belong here," the young man said, his voice firm. "And you're not the one who needs to prove anything. It's them that needs to learn to see people for who they really are." Over the following days, he found himself becoming more vocal. It wasn't that he'd made a conscious decision to fight every battle he saw, it was more that the encounters seemed to call for it. One evening, he was walking home when he noticed a teenager being followed by a security guard, a man who seemed to be suspicious of the young boy for no reason other than the way he looked. The teenager was dressed in a hoodie, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his pace quickening as the security guard tailed him closely. The young man's instinct kicked in. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his eyes locked on the security guard. The guard looked taken aback for a moment, then quickly recovered, his voice defensive. Just doing my job. This kid looks suspicious. The young man raised an eyebrow. Suspicious because of what? His clothes? His skin? Because I don't see anything suspicious about him. The guard faltered, then tried to justify himself, but the young man could see that the guard's confidence was shaken. He wasn't expecting someone to call him out, especially not so calmly. He turned to the teenager, who was looking at him with wide eyes, a mix of relief and disbelief on his face. You're fine, the young man said to the teen, giving him a reassuring smile. You don't need to be afraid. Just keep walking. As the teenager walked away, the young man stayed behind for a moment, making sure the guard didn't try anything else. Once the threat had passed, he continued on his way, but the encounter stayed with him, reminding him once again how important it was to stand up, even when it seemed easier to stay quiet. He couldn't turn a blind eye anymore. He had seen enough. In the days that followed, he became more active in his community, taking on small acts of advocacy where he could. Whether it was standing up for a colleague at work who had been unfairly criticized or simply offering a kind word to someone who had been dismissed, he began to understand that his voice, his calm, steady voice, was a tool that could make a difference. But it wasn't just about standing up for others. It was also about knowing when to listen, when to open his eyes wider and truly see the world around him, in all its complexities. The more he spoke out against the injustices he saw, the more he realized how much more there was to learn, how much more there was to understand. Every act of standing up, whether big or small, was a step toward change. And the young man had come to realize that it wasn't about winning a fight. It was about contributing to something bigger than himself, something that could make the world a more just place. One word at a time, the young man woke up to a bright Saturday morning, his mind a little quieter than it had been the past few days. The early sunlight streamed through the window, and the world outside seemed just a little bit more peaceful. But he knew better than to let the calm deceive him. Change, he realized, had a way of sneaking up on you when you least expected it. Just as his words at the bus stop had reverberated through his own heart, they had begun to resonate with others too. The week had passed since his confrontation with the woman at the bus stop, and though life seemed to continue as usual, he felt something stir beneath the surface. It wasn't just about him anymore. In the days that followed, his thoughts often turned to the ripple effect of his actions. The words he had spoken weren't just for the woman who had insulted him, they had been a call to something bigger, a challenge to all the silent bystanders who witnessed prejudice but did nothing to stop it. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Maria, the young woman from the cafe who had been so nervous when she first started working. Her message was short but to the point. I saw what you did the other day, and it meant a lot to me. I just wanted to say thanks. A smile spread across the young man's face. It wasn't that he was expecting praise, but the sincerity in Maria's words warmed him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had simply spoken up in the face of injustice, but it seemed that his actions had spoken louder than he realized. He put his phone down, feeling a little more grounded than before. He had spent years quietly watching the world around him, feeling like an observer, afraid to speak out or make waves. But somehow, that simple act of standing up had shifted his perspective. It had shown him that he didn't need to wait for others to make the first move, he could make the change himself. That afternoon, he went to the community center again. It was a place where he had volunteered off and on for the past few months, but lately, it felt more like a calling than just a way to pass the time. He had always believed in the power of giving back, of lending a hand to those in need. But now, it was different. He found himself listening to the stories of people who had been marginalized, rejected, or misunderstood because of where they came from or how they looked. One of the regulars at the center was an elderly man named Mr. Lewis. He was a quiet figure, his silver hair always neatly combed, and he had a way of watching people that made them feel like he understood them in a way no one else did. Mr. Lewis had lived through many things, both personal and societal struggles, and his life was a testament to resilience. He had seen the world change in ways that others couldn't even imagine. Yet, despite everything, he never lost his belief in the goodness of people. That afternoon, as the young man sat with him in the center, he found himself sharing the story of what had happened at the bus stop. He told Mr. Lewis about the woman's hateful words, his response, and how it had made him feel. Mr. Lewis listened attentively, his gaze thoughtful, his hands folded in his lap. When the young man finished, there was a long pause before Mr. Lewis spoke. "You know, son," Mr. Lewis said, his voice soft but firm, "there's a difference between standing up and standing out. A lot of people think standing up means raising their voice in anger or confrontation. But what you did wasn't about raising your voice. It was about standing firm in who you are. It's easy to let someone's hate change you, but it takes strength to stay true to yourself in the face of it." The young man sat quietly for a moment, absorbing Mr. Lewis's words. He had never thought about it that way. For so long, he had seen standing up as a reaction to hate, as a way of fighting back. But what Mr. Lewis was saying resonated with him in a deeper way. It wasn't about reacting, it was about owning his identity, his place in the world, and refusing to let someone else's prejudice define him. "I never really thought about it like that," the young man said softly, his mind turning over the words. "I've always tried to do what's right, but it's hard, you know? I feel like if I speak out, I'm going to make things worse or make people uncomfortable. But I guess sometimes, it's not about making things easier. It's about doing what's right." Mr. Lewis nodded, a slow smile crossing his face. "Exactly. The world isn't always going to be kind, son. But it's those who stand firm in their values, no matter the cost, who change it. You don't change people by fighting them. You change them by showing them a better way to be." Those words lingered in the young man's mind for the rest of the day. As he went about his life, doing the small tasks that made up his routine, he found himself paying attention more closely to the people around him. Every glance, every comment, every subtle action that reflected prejudice, it all stood out now. He no longer felt like an observer, passively watching the injustices unfold. Instead, he felt a new sense of responsibility, a calling to be a voice in the quiet. A few days later, at work, he noticed an elderly customer sitting at one of the tables, reading a newspaper. His name was Mr. Henderson, and though he was polite, there was an air of loneliness about him. As the young man took his order, he noticed that Mr. Henderson's hands trembled slightly as he held the cup of coffee. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him pause. When he brought Mr. Henderson his coffee, he decided to take a moment to chat. "How's your day going?" he asked gently. Mr. Henderson smiled faintly, though his eyes seemed distant. "It's going all right," he said, his voice quiet. "Just the usual. It gets a little lonely, though." The young man nodded. "I understand. Sometimes, it's hard to connect with people, isn't it?" Mr. Henderson looked up, his eyes meeting his for the first time. There was something in those eyes, a recognition, a shared understanding of the isolation that came with age, with experience, and with feeling like an outsider in your own world. For a brief moment, the young man saw beyond the surface. He saw the man who had lived a life of both triumph and hardship, and he realized that everyone, regardless of age or race, carried their own battles. "You know," Mr. Henderson said, breaking the silence, "it's the small connections that matter most. Sometimes, people forget that. We're all just trying to find our way." The young man smiled. "Yeah, I think you're right." And in that moment, he knew that the journey he was on wasn't just about standing up to hate or fighting against injustice, it was about connecting with others, about finding shared humanity in a world that often felt divided. It was about showing people, one person at a time, that kindness and understanding could make all the difference. The young man woke up the next morning feeling different. There was a quiet resolve in him, something that had grown over the last few weeks. He had spoken out once, but now, standing up felt like more of a lifestyle than a singular action. It wasn't just about the words he said in the moment, it was about the way he chose to move through the world every day. He had begun to notice small things that had once gone unnoticed, the way people looked at each other when they thought no one was watching, the unspoken judgments, the way silence often gave way to complacency. The more he became aware, the more he realized how often prejudice slipped through unnoticed, not just in grand gestures but in quiet, everyday exchanges. At work, he noticed it in the way some customers would react to the new barista, a young woman from India who had joined their team a few weeks earlier. Her accent, though soft and warm, seemed to make some customers uncomfortable. The young man caught the way people would lower their voices when ordering, the way they would hesitate before responding, or sometimes even ask for someone else to help them, as if somehow the woman behind the counter was less capable than the others. It wasn't overt racism, it was the subtler kind, something that could easily be dismissed if you weren't paying attention. He couldn't ignore it anymore. One afternoon, as the cafe buzzed with customers, he saw an elderly woman ask for extra sugar in her coffee. When the new barista reached for the sugar container, the woman snapped. "You don't need to be so slow, you know," she said sharply, her tone cutting through the air. The barista flinched, as if the words had physically hurt her. The young man was already moving before he fully realized it. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he wasn't going to let this moment pass. He approached the elderly woman's table, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," he said. "That wasn't necessary." The woman raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice defensive. "She's doing her best," he said, nodding toward the barista, who was standing by the counter, trying to look as though nothing had happened. "And I don't think it helps anyone to speak to someone like that, just because of their accent. We're all trying to get through the day. No one should have to feel like they don't belong." There was a pause as the elderly woman looked at him, her face a mix of confusion and indignation. She opened her mouth, perhaps to argue, but then seemed to think better of it. The young man took a step back and smiled softly. "It's just something to think about." He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he returned to his station, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had stood up, not just for the barista, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small because of something beyond their control, whether it was their accent, their appearance, or the color of their skin. The barista thanked him later that day, her voice filled with gratitude. "I didn't expect that," she said, her eyes wide. "Most people don't say anything. They just let it happen." "It's easy to stay quiet," the young man said, leaning against the counter. "But sometimes, silence lets bad things grow. If we don't speak up, it's like we're saying it's okay." After that day, the young man noticed a shift. There were fewer uncomfortable moments between the barista and customers. People who had once seemed uneasy now smiled more often, gave her the same respect they showed everyone else. It wasn't perfect, it never was, but it was a change, even a small one. And to him, that was progress. Later that week, as he was walking home, he passed a group of teenagers hanging out on a street corner. He'd seen them there before, and they seemed harmless enough, just kids being kids. But today, something felt different. One of them was wearing a hoodie with a political slogan that rubbed the young man the wrong way, a slogan that was known for being racially charged. It wasn't the kind of thing you saw every day, but it was out there, lurking in the shadows, just waiting for someone to speak it aloud. The young man hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should just walk by. But the hesitation was brief. He couldn't walk away. Not anymore. "Hey," he said, approaching the group. "You know what that slogan really means, right?" The teenager wearing the hoodie turned to him, a flash of defiance in his eyes. "It's just a joke, man. Nothing to get worked up about." The young man met his gaze, unwavering. "It's not a joke. It's a statement that excludes people. It's a message that says some people don't belong here. And I'm telling you, that's not funny." For a moment, the group was silent, the words hanging in the air. The teenager with the hoodie looked around at his friends, unsure how to respond. Finally, he shrugged, pulling the hoodie tighter around himself. "Whatever, man." But something had shifted. The young man could see it in the way the group reacted, in the way they looked at the hoodie now as if they were seeing it for the first time. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a fight one. But it was a reminder that words mattered. Every day, every conversation. And sometimes, one person speaking up could make someone rethink something they had never questioned before. As he walked away, the young man felt the weight of his actions sink in. It wasn't just about speaking out when it was easy or convenient, it was about making sure you never let hate become the default setting. He couldn't change everyone, but he could show them, bit by bit, that the world he wanted to live in was one where people respected each other, where their differences were celebrated instead of scorned. It was a slow, steady process, but it had to start somewhere. And today, he realized that somewhere was him. As the weeks rolled on, the young man found himself more and more involved in the daily ebb and flow of his community. Every day seemed to bring new opportunities to act, to speak out, and to make his presence known in ways he hadn't considered before. It wasn't that he was seeking validation, it was that he was beginning to see how interconnected everything was, the choices people made, the way they reacted to one another, and the small gestures of kindness or cruelty that rippled outward. One evening, after work, he stopped by the local park to clear his head. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, and he felt a familiar calmness settle over him as he walked along the winding path. He had been working hard lately, balancing his job with his volunteer work at the community center, and sometimes it felt like his efforts weren't enough. It was easy to get lost in the day-to-day grind, to wonder if the small acts he was contributing were really making a difference. As he reached a bench near the lake, he sat down and watched the ripples on the water. His thoughts wandered to the recent incidents he had confronted, the woman at the bus stop, the elderly customer at the cafe, the teenager with the racially charged hoodie. They all seemed so small in the grand scheme of things. But then again, wasn't that the point? Change didn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes, it was the smallest acts of standing up, of choosing to be kind, that planted the seeds of transformation. Just as he was about to get up and leave, he noticed a group of kids gathered near the playground. They were laughing, chatting, but something in the way they were gathered caught his attention. One of the boys, a lanky teenager with a shy demeanor, was standing slightly apart from the others. He wasn't actively being excluded, but it was clear that he was on the edge of the group, his back hunched as if he were trying to shrink into the shadows. The young man recognized the feeling. He had seen it in himself all those years ago, the quiet exclusion, the subtle ways people were pushed to the margins without anyone really noticing. He couldn't ignore it. Not now. He stood up and walked over to the group, his footsteps slow and deliberate. As he approached, he greeted the kids casually, offering them a warm smile. The group acknowledged him, though some seemed a bit wary. Kids were always hesitant around adults who didn't seem to fit into their world. But the young man wasn't here to disrupt. He just wanted to make sure that the boy standing alone didn't feel invisible. He turned to the teenager who had been standing off to the side. "Hey, you're looking a little out of the loop," he said gently. "You good?" The teenager looked up, surprised by the question. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, as if unsure of how to respond. The young man waited patiently, not pushing him, just giving him the space to speak. After a long moment, the boy finally shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. Just feel like I don't fit in, you know?" The young man nodded, understanding more than he let on. "I get it. It's tough sometimes, isn't it? Trying to fit into a group when it feels like you're always on the outside looking in." The boy hesitated, but then something changed in his posture. The walls that had been built up around him seemed to soften. "Yeah, exactly. I don't know, I just don't think they get me. I don't know how to talk to them." The young man sat down on the bench beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. "Sometimes it's not about fitting in," he said softly. "It's about being yourself, even when it feels like everyone else is playing a different game. And you don't have to do it alone." The boy looked at him, his expression still unsure, but open. "But what if they don't like who I am?" The young man smiled, a reassuring glint in his eye. "Trust me, if they're the right people, they'll like the real you. And if they don't? Well, that's their problem." You can't force someone to see your worth. There was a long pause as the boy processed his words. Finally, he nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Thanks. I think I needed to hear that. The young man stood up, clapping the boy gently on the shoulder. Anytime, man. You've got this. As he walked away, he glanced back one last time. The boy was no longer standing on the edge of the group. He had joined in, blending into the conversation with newfound confidence. The shift was subtle, but it was there. It was a reminder that even the smallest gestures, even the briefest words of encouragement, could spark something powerful. Later that week, while volunteering at the community center, the young man came across a flyer for an upcoming event, an open forum to discuss racial and cultural awareness in the community. It was being organized by a local group that focused on social justice and equality, and it seemed like the perfect opportunity for him to take his efforts a step further. He had been speaking out in small ways, but this was bigger. It was a chance to engage with a larger group of people, to have a real conversation about the issues that mattered most to him. He signed up immediately, knowing this was his next step. But it wasn't just about speaking out for himself or others anymore. It was about helping the entire community become more aware, more open to understanding, and more willing to make the world a better place, one conversation at a time. As the event grew nearer, the young man found himself feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. It was one thing to speak up when it was one-on-one, it was another thing entirely to do it in front of a crowd. But he knew it was time. The world needed more people who were willing to stand up, who were willing to have the hard conversations, and who weren't afraid to speak their truth. And so, as he prepared for the forum, he realized something important. The journey he had started wasn't just about changing others, it was about changing himself. Every act of kindness, every word spoken, every effort made to create a better, more understanding world was an act of self-growth. The more he gave, the more he learned, and the more he became the person he had always aspired to be. The journey wasn't easy. It wasn't instant. But with each step, he knew that he was making a difference, one conversation, one moment of connection, at a time. The day of the community forum arrived, and the young man could feel the weight of it in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just any event. It was the culmination of weeks of thinking, of reflecting, and, most importantly, of acting. He had stood up in moments of injustice, but now, standing in front of a group of strangers, his words would carry more weight than ever before. He had come a long way from that initial encounter at the bus stop, but this was different, this was bigger. As he walked into the venue, the first thing that struck him was the diversity of the crowd. People of all ages, backgrounds, and experiences were gathered, some eager to engage, others more reserved, unsure of how to start the conversation. It was exactly what he had hoped for, a space for open dialogue, where everyone could share their thoughts and learn from one another. The young man found a seat near the front, trying to calm his nerves. He didn't know why he was nervous, after all, he had been speaking up for weeks now. But something about standing in front of a group of people with different experiences made him feel exposed, vulnerable. It wasn't just about sharing his thoughts anymore, it was about giving others the chance to speak, to feel heard. The facilitator of the event, an older woman with a calm demeanor, stood at the front of the room and addressed the group. Welcome, everyone. We're here today to have a conversation. A real conversation about race, culture, and how we can all work together to build a more inclusive community. It's not always going to be comfortable, but that's the point. We need to start feeling uncomfortable in order to grow. The words resonated with him. He had spent much of his life trying to avoid uncomfortable situations, trying to stay quiet in the face of things that didn't sit right with him. But the truth was, discomfort was necessary. Without it, there could be no change, no growth. He had learned that from his own journey, from the confrontation at the bus stop to his everyday acts of speaking up, to the conversations he had started in the cafe, in the park, and beyond. The event began with small group discussions, and the young man found himself seated with a woman in her mid-40s, a retired teacher, and a younger man who worked as a local artist. As the conversation unfolded, he realized how much more there was to learn from others. The retired teacher spoke about the systemic challenges she had seen in the educational system, how the lack of representation of different cultures in textbooks and curricula shaped the way children viewed the world. The young artist shared his experiences of being treated differently because of his appearance, the assumptions that people made based on his style and his background. The woman, who had been quiet for most of the discussion, finally spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "It's not enough to just be not racist. We need to be actively anti-racist. We need to call out the everyday things we overlook, those little moments where we let prejudice slide. The way we react when we see someone being treated unfairly or differently because of their skin color or their accent." The young man nodded in agreement, his thoughts aligning with hers. It was exactly what he had been feeling, the need to be proactive, not just passive in the face of injustice. For too long, he had been a silent observer. But now, he understood that silence was complicity. Every time he had chosen to speak up, every time he had called someone out on their prejudice, it was a step toward breaking down the walls that divided them. As the forum went on, he found his own voice growing stronger. At first, his words had been hesitant, but now, they came more naturally. He shared his experiences, how, growing up, he had internalized the stereotypes others had imposed on him, how he had spent years trying to fit into a world that didn't always accept him for who he was. But he had learned, through his own mistakes and triumphs, that embracing his identity was the key to moving forward. "I spent a lot of time trying to prove myself to others," he said, his voice gaining strength. "But what I realized is that I don't need to prove anything. I just need to be myself. And so do all of you. We all have a place here. The world doesn't get to define us, we define ourselves." He saw a few heads nod in agreement, and for the first time in the forum, he felt a deep connection to the people around him. They were all struggling with similar challenges, trying to carve out a space where they could exist without fear of judgment or hate. It wasn't just a conversation about race, it was about humanity. About respecting each other's stories and acknowledging the pain and triumph that each person carried. As the forum came to a close, the young man felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a profound sense of responsibility. This wasn't the end of his journey, it was just the beginning. The conversations that had started here would continue long after the event was over. And as much as he had shared, he knew there was more to learn. The forum had sparked something in him, a desire to keep pushing for change, not just in the world around him, but within himself. Walking out of the venue that evening, he felt lighter than he had in a long time. He had shared his truth, heard the truths of others, and realized that change didn't happen in isolation. It happened when people came together, when they acknowledged each other's pain and celebrated their differences. And, in doing so, they built a world that was just a little bit kinder, a little bit more understanding. The young man smiled to himself. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But he knew now, with certainty, that his voice mattered. His actions mattered. And the world was better for it. Every conversation, every step forward, was one more piece of the puzzle that was slowly transforming his community, and himself, into something stronger. Something more united. Something greater than before. As he walked home that evening, he felt an overwhelming sense of hope. It wasn't just about what he had done, it was about what was still to come. And for the first time, he believed that change was not just possible, it was inevitable.